hands-on, I think, is the better approach to pruning, but with COVID, we will do the best we can. So why do we want to talk about pruning? The primary reason is pruning is critical to good production within the orchard. And the reason is more than just a single one. First off, it can help reduce disease pressures. So whenever we do a good job with pruning, we are increasing air circulation throughout the canopy of the tree, as well as sunlight penetration. And both of those reduce wetness. And the reason that's important is because wet conditions promote diseases. And so anytime we can minimize wetness, we're also minimizing the environmental conditions that promote diseases. So it's important from a pest control standpoint with diseases. It's also important because it helps direct the energy of the tree into fruit production. So certainly a tree wants to grow and get bigger. If we can take that energy, excuse me, and put the focus of it into growing larger fruit for us, we get better harvest. So keep in mind, it's not just something that's about aesthetics. It's not just something that is a casual thing we do. There are some very specific good things that is accomplished when we do a good job with pruning. And one thing I'll say up front, probably the number one mistake that happens in the home orchard is people simply don't prune. There just isn't enough pruning happening. And I think it's one that, as we go through this, you'll see that there's kind of a few rules to follow, and that if you follow those, it's not as hard to get started as you might first think. So let me just say up front, everybody that has fruit trees has the ability to do a good job pruning. And hopefully today, I'll give you some strategies to do that. Another thing we'll mention is training. So training is not pruning in and of itself, but it's part of the package. So this basically is kind of a broader scope. You could include pruning under training if you wanted to, but basically these are some strategies we use to help manipulate the tree or form the tree into the shape we want, which can help with earlier production, higher fruit quality, and makes the tree easier to care for. So pruning is maybe our primary tool to accomplish this, but it's not the sole tool to accomplish it. Oh, let me go back. We're going to use a lot of very specific terms today, and I'll do my best as we go through to try to explain those clearly. This is just one graphic I really liked because I thought it did a good job of showing a number of different terms that we may use today. Some of the main ones I mentioned, scaffolds are talking about the main branches, and certainly there are primary and secondary scaffolds. So when you have a primary scaffold, that's the main branch, and then a branch arising off of that one would be a secondary scaffold. Water sprout are adventitious roots, shoots that rise straight up from the tree. Oftentimes these are in response to pruning, but they're something that are very common on trees, and so become familiar with that term and understand what they would look like. And we'll also be talking a lot about branch angle, or sometimes they'll be referred to as the crotch of a branch. And it's basically the angle between the branch and its point of attachment, whether it's a primary or secondary limb or scaffold. And the reason it's important is it's about the ability for that branch to hold weight long term. And so it is important, and we'll talk about some specifics with those. And there's a lot of other terms depicted there on that graphic, and certainly they're important. But as we go through, we'll kind of bring some more of those out. One thing you need to be familiar with is how to identify the annual growth or the growth that occurred, for instance, last year on a tree. This is a cherry limb, but I thought it was a great picture to depict that stacked rings. So lots of times whenever we are looking at the new growth or the last year's growth, what we see is this series of almost stacked like rings or wrinkly appearance. And oftentimes we'll see, for instance, to the left of this is the newest growth, and to the right of it is the year prior. So oftentimes there will be a significant color difference. Here it's not as dramatic, but certainly you see more of a reddening of the bark on the older, while this is completely gray. And so there is a color difference often, but not always. But you will see kind of that wrinkly appearance, those stacked rings. What's good about this is when you can identify this, one, it helps let you know how old a portion of a tree is that you're pruning on. And it also lets you judge, what sort of growth are you getting season to season. One of the things that can help inform us about how much fertilizer we might use is to look at how much growth or extension we're getting of those branches each year. So understanding where last year's growth ended and the prior years begin is a useful skill to have. One thing to understand when it comes to fruiting with apples and pears, most apples and pears will flower on short twigs that are called spurs. And so what you'll notice on this, if you look at this, you'll see those stacked rings or wrinkles again. They're very tight because these don't elongate much from season to season. They grow a little bit. But what happens is we have these flower buds here at the end, and those are what actually are bearing the fruit for us on most apples and pears. So, as a general thing, we say apples and pears are spur-bearing fruits. Stone fruits such as peaches, cherries, plums, they don't have the spurs in the same way. Except not all apples have spurs. So there are some types of apples that are called tip bearing, and there are some that have both spurs and tip bearing. And what that literally means is they are blooming at the tips of their branches at the end. So this does change a little bit how we will manage the pruning. When we have varieties that are tip bearing, and some of the more common ones are things like Fuji, Granny Smith, and Empire. There's also partial tip bearers such as Pink Lady, Northern Spy, and Shamrock, and there are others. This is not in any way, shape, or form an exhaustive list. But whenever we look at pruning tip bearers, we want to preserve the tip of last year's branches that grew as much as possible because that's where this season's flower blossoms are going to happen. So if you're looking at your trees and you don't see, any spurs on it and they're a mature tree, you would expect to see those. It may be that it's tip bearing. So if you've ever done a lot of pruning and you just, year after year don't get a good yield, it may be tip bearing and you may be removing those floral structures each season. So this is one of those ones where if you're not sure, if it's not really clear, waiting till the tree is in bloom and looking closely can help key you in whether you're looking at a tip bearing or a spur bearing apple. There are two types of cuts and pruning, and that's it. So it's pretty straightforward. And they're very different cuts, and we use them at different times and for different purposes. The first one is a heading back cut or a heading cut. This encourages new growth. It does that because what a heading back cut is you're removing the terminal or apical end of a branch. What that does is that changes the flow of hormones within that branch. So auxin is a hormone that is produced, and one of the things it does is it causes buds below it to go dormant, or it subordinates them, so it slows their growth. And so whenever we remove that apical or end bud, suddenly we've removed the auxin, which was keeping those buds dormant, and now they break dormancy and grow. So if you have ever headed back anything in the garden, if we're talking about, growing herbs or any number of other plants, what you were doing is removing those apical buds or those end buds to interrupt the flow of that hormone auxin. And so whenever we want to encourage growth, we use heading back cuts. Typically, these are used on younger trees, but also sometimes for renewing older trees. So sometimes we may lose some limbs on a tree. We may have part of a tree that's not filling out as well as we would like when it comes to growth. And so we can induce some branch formation by using heading back cuts. Now, the second type of cut is a thinning cut. And what thinning cuts do is it reduces the amount of canopy present. And thinning cuts basically take a branch off back to their origin. So whether it's back to the main trunk, especially when the trees are younger, or whether it's just back to a primary or secondary limb, we're not hitting anything back. We're just completely thinning out and removing. And so these we use more often on mature trees, but also on young trees where we're wanting to remove limbs that maybe aren't positioned where we would like, or maybe have an issue with them. So those are the two types of cuts, heading back and thinning. And just keep in mind, there is a difference when we use which one. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So I mentioned the angle of branches. Whenever we are pruning trees and training trees, we want to select branches that have wide angles. And the reason being is depicted in the two illustrations you see there. So on your left, what you have is a good angle, an angle that we would be happy to have. And what you see here is you see these continuous lines of growth. And what that's telling us is that this limb has complete attachment across that entire joint there. There is no interruption. And so this is a very strong attachment. As a rule of thumb, we would say we're looking for 45 to 65 degrees. That's not an exact measurement. You can adjust that a little bit, but that general range. What happens whenever we start getting tighter than that or smaller, so it's more vertical, is what you start seeing depicted on the right side. What literally happens is bark becomes included in between there. And so from this point to this point, where we don't have those continuous lines flowing to demonstrate continuous growth, it's actually interrupted by that dead bark material. So this branch literally only has about half as much attachment to that tree. And so this is why when we get heavy snow loads, ice loads, or even heavy fruit loads, these branches start breaking out. So if you're familiar with Bradford pears, and if you've had one for decades or seen them around, you know they very commonly split apart, especially with ice, wind, or heavy snow loads. The reason that happens is this right here. They have very narrow branch angles, and they're very weak. So we want to avoid this because it causes problems down the road for us. So there are some things we can do with training, such as actually spreading limbs, and we'll talk about that soon. And so there are some ways to get around this, but very often when we have these narrow angles, when these things are wanting to go more vertical, it's going to be weakly attached, and the best thing to do for the health of that tree is actually to remove it. And again, removing branches when they're younger is always less of a stress. So we want to try to catch these as early as possible. It is important to note that whenever we look at the orchard, not every kind of tree is pruned exactly the same way. So in general, the stone fruits, these are your peaches, your plums, cherries, are open center or open vase. And we'll talk about what that is. Apples and pears are more typically central leader. The way I remember central leader is it kind of looks like a Christmas tree, and we'll go into depth with that. But understand and recognize that there are other systems of pruning. Some of the extremely dwarf varieties, especially when trellised, aren't really sort of either one. It's a very different approach. And certainly sometimes within the landscape, we don't have semi-dwarf trees. We have much more full stalk trees that are larger in size. And sometimes when they're very mature, trying to bring those back tensions for a central leader approach is going to be very challenging, maybe not quite possible. And there are even other methodologies of pruning apples and pears. There are multiple leader trees and things like that. So there are other styles, but today we're going to focus on the open center or open vase for stone fruits and central leader for apples and pears. I had mentioned that, pruning isn't the only option for shaping trees. And here you see a very basic depiction of that central leader system and the open center for tree fruits. And so let's go through a couple of options on how we can use training to help get those desired shapes. One of those is called bud notching. So whenever we want to have a branch somewhere, but we don't have one there, there's a couple of things we can actually do to encourage that. And so one of those things is find a bud that is dormant, that is not growing, and actually cut a notch above it. And let me move to the next picture. And what that literally does is that physically stops the flow of that hormone auxin to that bud. And so then that bud will break and grow. So sometimes if we have a tree that we don't have a nice scaffold branch on one side where we would like, because we'll talk about it in a minute, but we like those to be arranged around the tree itself so that they're evenly spread out. And if they're not, this is one way we can sometimes induce a branch to form. We can also notch below a branch to cause auxin basically to pile up there, and that can actually help slow or weaken the growth of a branch. So certainly notching is a tool that sometimes we can use. It's more frequently used on younger trees. Another thing we can do is actually physically manipulating limbs. So one of the things, believe it or not, when trees are very small, when they have new growth, just attaching a clothespin to our main trunk and letting that help push and direct the growth of those new shoots or branches can give us a better branch angle. Now, this is something we don't keep on there very long. We keep it on there a month and a half, 2 months at the most. We're doing these in the spring when growth is supple and can be moved. And so we are, taking advantage of that youth of the tree. So again, this would be for very small trees. Newly planted trees are what this is ideal for. We can also do the same thing even with toothpicks. And when we get to a little bit larger tree, we can use what's called limb spreaders. There's any number of different types of limb spreaders. Some of them are just notched boards where you cut a V in each end of a 1x2 or even a 1x1. It just helps physically spread out the angle that the branches are at. You can also put nails in the end of those boards and let it poke into the bark. Yes, it's a hole in the bark, but it's very minimal, so it generally would not cause a problem. There are plastic spreaders that, again, are kind of V-shaped on each end that you can put in there. You can actually put a stake in the ground and tie a limb down to the angle you want. You can actually attach a physical weight to a limb and bring it down that way. Any of these ways to spread a limb is accomplishing the goal of increasing that branch angle. So again, this is happening when these trees are young. When you have a large mature tree, this is not going to be effective. You're not going to change a branch angle easily. So taking care to do this early in the tree's life makes the job much easier later. One of the things I always like to show when I'm doing a presentation related to fruit is just looking at kind of the seasonality of tasks around the orchard. And so you can see now we're in February, and so we are in that period when it's a good time to start pruning in our region. We can allow pruning through the bloom period if necessary, but certainly dormant pruning is typically what we would do in our orchard. Summer pruning is possible as well, particularly if you need to thin a tree more. So one of the things that can happen because of our pruning in the dormant period is we get a lot of growth. And so if we see that happening, we can actually go in June, for instance, and thin some of that out. We don't always do that, and so there are cases when it would be useful and maybe when it would not, but it's certainly something that we can have in the toolbox to help us. Whenever we want to start pruning, one, we do want to wait until the February time period. And the reason we do that is if we prune too early in, let's say fall or even early winter. So, the trees have dropped their leaves, they're going dormant, but they haven't hardened off quite fully yet to winter. And so what happens is pruning can actually sometimes reduce the hardiness of the tree. And so if we do it very early in the winter, we're risking more winter injury or death to branches. So we wait till late winter to do the pruning. But within the orchard, we can prune things based on the earliest ones for the most hardy and later for the least hardy. So when we look at actually the ability of the tree to withstand, cold temperatures, the most hardy to least would be apple, pear, European plums, peaches, Asian plums, and then cherries. Now, sometimes with peaches, we do actually delay blooming until we get, we delay pruning until we get into bloom. And the reason we do that is very often we see bloom death because we have late frost. So by waiting until it's very late to prune those peaches, you actually are preserving as many flowers as possible so that if you were to lose, for instance, half the flowers due to a frost event, there's more there that year to have a crop off of. Another thing to understand with hardiness and survivability, your oldest trees are going to be your most hardy and the youngest trees are going to be your least. So within the orchard, you would start with your oldest trees and end with your youngest. Honestly, for most backyard growers, the size of orchards you have, you're probably talking about a couple of days difference, oldest to youngest at most. So it's not a big deal for most backyard growers, but certainly the larger scale growers starting at the oldest when they have weeks and weeks of pruning makes a lot of sense. Pruning tools, it doesn't take a tremendous amount of equipment to do a good job with pruning. You'll note that there's not a chainsaw on your screen. We shouldn't be in a position where we're needing to use a chainsaw to do our pruning. It's basically going to be hand tools. So the one thing I don't have depicted there with the picture, but you do see listed, are pole pruners. Pole pruners are very handy. They allow you to reach the upper levels of a tree without being on a ladder. Certainly getting on a ladder is fine, and it is actually very useful. So I probably should add a ladder to this list of tools. But, hand pruners, a hand saw, and I will say that pruning saws are very different than a carpenter saw that we may have. They are designed specifically to cut green wood, wet wood, without filling their teeth, without failing to remove the sawdust as it's cut. So they cut very differently. A pruning saw would not work well in a carpenter shop, nor would a carpenter saw work well in the orchard. And again, these don't have to be extremely large. Handheld ones are excellent. There are large ones that can be purchased, and you may choose to do that, but by and large, handheld ones anywhere from 6, 8, 10 inches length and blade is great. Good thing about these is the blade is replaceable. So over time you will dull that, and sharper tools are definitely preferred in the orchard. It leaves a more easily to heal wound versus dull tools. So there's a number of good brands out there, and so look for those. Loppers are good for getting those branches that are sort of in between hand pruners and needing a saw. But be careful that you don't try to cut too larger branches with loppers. So, different size loppers have different limitations, and different folks have different physical strength. So I really like using saws a lot because honestly, sometimes it's easier to get a saw into certain areas, and loppers can sometimes be a challenge depending on, especially if a tree is overgrown. I will mention that, goggles and a hat are useful. And I'm not literally saying a hard hat, although if you want to wear a hard hat, that would be acceptable. But whenever you're in the canopy around those trees, having something to protect your eyes to make sure you don't walk into the end of a branch, and even a hat that will let you feel, branches above you before you smack into them with your head is a good thing. So I encourage you to look at goggles or a hat while you're doing your pruning. So let's talk a little bit about the actual physical details of doing good pruning cuts. So whenever we are cutting, and this would be, for instance, the heading back cut, we want to cut about a 1/4 inch above the bud, and we want to leave it at about a 45-degree angle. And the reason we want to do that is, one, the angle allows for water to shed off well, and that distance from the bud will allow it to heal over. So what happens if we do like on the very far left, where we have a significant distance that we leave above, a stub above that bud, this is never going to heal over because this is actually going to start dying back. And in fact, that's going to be an entry point for diseases. It could be an entry point for insects, and it jeopardizes the ability of that bud to actually survive. Here, where we have a sloping angle directly at the bud, that's not good. It's going to throw water onto that bud. Here we are too close to the bud, so this is never going to heal over, and eventually that bud's going to die. With this very steep angle, what we have done is we have literally created a larger wound than is necessary, and that's going to be more difficult for that tree to close over. If we don't have a clean cut, this is a problem. So this is a wound that's going to have difficulty closing over. And again, a correct cut, we have a good angle that sheds water. It's a close enough distance that the tree is still going to be able to heal over that. And it's as small as possible and still accomplish those things. So again, having a good, nice cut when we head back is important so that growth happens the way we think. I'll mention that here we have this outside bud. So in this case, when we prune like this bud is going to take and grow that way. If, for instance, this was back into the tree, then we just made a mistake because we don't want the growth to go back into the tree. We want to go out away from the tree. So understand that when we do a heading back cut, pay attention to which side of the branch that bud is on, not only to get a good angle sloping away from the bud, but also so that we're directing that new growth to go in a desired direction. So sometimes we come in and make what's called a bench cut. And so that's when we have a more upright branch, but there's a side branch that we could allow to take over and grow the direction we want. Again, we would want a sloping cut on it so that water drains off well and about 1/4 inch above. Quite honestly, this is probably one we want to avoid if we can. This is, in my opinion, this is an instance where we should have caught this branch when it was younger and maybe use a spreader to get the angle down. This is never as good as having a good branch angle from the get-go. But in times we may find that we have to use this. So I always say this should be used rarely, but occasionally it is a good cut to know that we can make to redirect that growth in a more outward direction. Anytime we're cutting large branches, and this goes to even in the landscape, with shade trees, or anytime we're cutting a branch and we can't have a good handhold on it and good control. So sometimes whenever we're reaching higher levels where we're kind of standing on our toes, we always want to make sure we use a 3-cut method. So typically this would be done when we're using a saw to cut a branch. And what the 3-cut method is, it's very simple. It's you undercut the branch away from the branch collar first, and then the second cut is to actually remove the branch. The reason we do this is lots of times people start with cut number 2 as depicted in the illustration there. They just start sawing from the top down. And what happens, that cut will hinge open and that branch begins to fall. And when it does that, it's very likely to split out the bottom of that remaining stub or a junction to the trunk and also strip the bark off. And whenever we remove those cambial layers, those bark layers, we've removed the ability for that wound to close over well. So basically we just left a big gaping wound on a tree. Whereas if we first undercut and then come back with cut number 2, we are able to drop that branch. There's no risk of it stripping bark down the rest of that stub to the trunk. And then we come back with cut number 3 close to the branch collar where it's going to heal over. So I just kind of introduced a new word or concept to you, and that's branch collars. So whenever we look at trees, very often there is a dramatic and noticeable ridging or wrinkling, or even, again, those stacked rings where a branch is attached to another branch, whether it's the trunk or just a scaffold branch. What we want to do is cut just outside of that ring. The reason is that ring is actively growing cells. And so whenever we cut outside of that, just to the outside, we allow those cells to close that wound. So if you've ever seen prunings on trees and it looks like there is a bark donut, if you will, growing on the end of a branch that was pruned, or growing on a trunk where they removed a branch. That's a good thing. That is literally the inward rolling wound wood closing that in. That's what we want to see. We can only get that when we make our final cuts outside that branch collar. So again, when we have those branches that require a 3-step cut to remove, that number 3 cut allows us to cut that branch to the proper distance with regard to the branch collar. And it's a clean cut, it heals quickly and does well. If we get too close to the trunk, and 40, 50 years ago, there were people doing what was called flush cuts, which would be more depicted what you see there in red. Flush cuts cut through that collar, and that collar is not able to then heal over well. So this is where you start getting cavities and things like that in trees, where wounds simply cannot close and heal. It begins a slide downward when it comes to the health of a tree. So always leave those branch collars intact. When we're using hand pruners to remove very small branches, oftentimes this collar is very minimal. It's not dramatic, but it is something to make sure that we pay attention to, small or large branches, and that we cut just outside. And what that does is it allows that branch to heal over. And of course, there's always the exception. So there is a cut called a Dutch cut, where you almost leave a stub. And we never want to leave a stub, because again, a stub prevents that branch collar from closing around it. And it's a very bad thing. You can see very often people will prune on trees, even again, shade trees in the landscape, and there's all these stubs that are left. And those stubs do not do well. They never close over. Oftentimes that's an entry point for disease. So we never want to leave a stub. But on the rare occasion, particularly if we have to remove a branch, and often when we're looking at trees that are very dwarf and that don't have a lot of limbs on them, sometimes we need a limb back in that place. And so one way we can do that is a Dutch cut. We do purposely leave a little bit of a stub. We do leave it at an angle so that the bottom is longer. And what we are wanting to do is to allow those dormant buds, or latent buds as the graphic depicts them, to go ahead and grow from that. And so sometimes when we need a replacement branch, we can leave a little bit of stub specifically to get this branch to form. Because we have a branch then, that will help that wound heal over, even though it's further away from the branch collar than we ordinarily would have it. So that branch is going to enlarge, grow quickly, and that will help close that wound ultimately. So there is a scenario where occasionally, very occasionally, it is okay to leave almost a stub, but only if we are purposely trying to induce a branch to form there. So let's get into some specifics about pruning the different types of trees. So stone fruits, again, peaches, nectarines, apricots, cherries, and plums. Nectarines and apricots will almost never successfully fruit in our area because they bloom entirely too early. It goes back to chilling hour requirements. If you joined us for our talk on Thursday evening regarding pest control, we talked some about chilling hours in there. And that's the stumbling block with nectarines and apricots. They have very low chilling hour requirements, and they bloom way too early for our region, but they would be grown in this same methodology. And so what this is it's where we literally don't have a central leader. You can see there, it does not look like a Christmas tree, so to speak. It's very open in the center. And the reason we do that is we want excellent sunlight and air penetration into the center of that tree to prevent fruit and leaf wetness. So it has that open center to accomplish that. We want the scaffold limbs, or primary limbs, spaced evenly around the trunk. We want some ground clearance, so we do want those up off the ground some. One thing to remember about trees: wherever a branch starts at, it's going to remain the same distance from the ground until the day the tree dies. A branch literally doesn't move up the tree as the tree grows. Sometimes people will attach a basketball goal to a tree, for instance, and they sometimes mistakenly think, well, as the tree goes, maybe the goal will move up as the tree grows. Just doesn't happen. Trees grow from the end point of their branches, so those branches are never going to raise up to a good height if they start too low. So keep that in mind. Using limb spreaders is very much encouraged the first couple of years with the stone fruits because it does help get that much more open habit to it. They will try to grow a central leader. Most trees want to do that to a certain extent, and so we do have to actively prune these and make sure that they stay this open center habit. And so here we have a couple of different depictions. One, the aerial view, just to give you an idea of we want the arrangement as much as possible to be spread evenly around that tree, because again, we want to capture as much sunlight as possible without shading each other. So each of these limbs is going off in a different direction. We typically see with the open vase or open center trees, 3 to 5 primary branches. Here we see 4. From a side view, that same tree, what you notice is there's no central point that's higher than everything else. There's no pyramid shape. There's no Christmas tree shape to it. And that's because basically these are all equal in height, more or less. And so this is kind of a physical depiction of it once it gets to more maturity. So whenever we plant these trees, uh, we want branching to start about 15 inches off the ground. And so ordinarily, even if we buy a tree that is older and larger, we're going to cut that off about 30 inches above the ground. And what we're going to do is then select 3 to 5 branches to be our primary scaffold branches. Typically, we'll go ahead and maybe err on the side of too many, as long as they're a good branch. We'll look at putting in some spacers in there to help get the angle correct if we need to, because we'd rather have an extra one that we can later remove after we decide that we've got too many, as opposed to trim it down to only 3 and end up having 2 because one of them suddenly has a problem. That first summer, we would look at pruning back any growth that pops out other than our primary scaffolds. We will trim back anything that's trying to grow up as a central leader, as well as pruning the scaffold some to keep that open center. So we don't want to leave these interior smaller branches that pop up off those primaries. And then at 1 year, you can see we have some of that growth that has resulted on those interior branches. We come in, we thin that out, we thin the trees out, and we make sure that directed growth is outward and that open vase appearance. So this is just kind of another depiction of that. The biggest thing, and I liked this graphic because it did, I think, distill it into a very simple process, but we remove the central leader. We select 3 to 4. Again, 5 is okay as well. Primary branches to leave for growth. And we're paying careful attention with that angle of attachment because we want strong attachment. You can very easily have branches split out if we don't have good branch angles. So be careful with stone fruits, especially on this, because the way we're growing them, they're kind of a little bit weaker proposition to begin with. Um, Understand too that fruit on these trees is happening from where it was last year. So these trees are setting their flower buds during this summer, and next spring is when we'll see those bloom and grow into peaches. Uh, and another thing to understand, very often we see that peaches will have triple bud arrangement with 2 fruiting buds and then 1 leaf bud. So be aware of that. If you see a leaf bud, you may also see those flower buds nearby. So make sure you don't remove those flower buds. And again, because we are maintaining a kind of aggressive approach to this, where we're very specific on where we want growth to be, very often we may be pruning off 60 to 80% of last year's growth. We do that to control that shape because, again, it's critically important that that interior stays open. And so keep in mind that, we do want to leave good, strong new wood on there. This isn't 100% of last year's growth. So when we see good pencil size diameter 1-year-old wood, that is often good to leave on there because it's healthy. At that size, that's a good size for its age, and then we can actually shorten those back. So again, we will have to do some heading back, some shortening of those limbs, but certainly we do want to leave the best each season. So central leader, very different tree. I've already alluded to it, pyramidal shape, Christmas tree shape, whichever you prefer. What's important to note on this is while we have multiple tiers of branches, each tier that is above a lower is shorter in length. We do that so we get good sunlight penetration. What happens, especially with apple trees as they get mature, is the tops end up larger than the bottom. And what that causes is severe shading on the bottom of those trees. And we'll have sometimes tremendous dieback of these lower tiers simply because they weren't getting enough sun. So one of the challenges if we have a neglected or abandoned apple tree that's very mature is lots of time there is a significant amount of branch dieback in the lower tiers. And so then that's putting all of our apples and everything up very high, and that can create a challenge for us with management. From a top view, we again are seeing that we have this radial arrangement where we have even spacing around the tree. Again, 3 to 5, it doesn't have to be specifically 4, but we basically want our main branches to be going in different directions. Again, coming to the illustration, we select anywhere from 3 to 4 or 5 primary scaffold branches, 20 to 30 inches up from the ground. We select the next set of scaffold branches, 18 to 20 inches above the first set. And then we want to make sure that we're trying. So if we were to have, let's go back one. If these are our primary branches, the first set, this lower set, the next set we would love to have in between here. And the reason we do that is then we don't have branches growing over top of each other and having direct shading. So we try to alternate spacing between the different tiers so that they don't end up directly over top of each other, because that would be more limiting on sunlight. So we do our very best to try to space those out. That's what point C is saying. And again, we do pay attention to that degree angle. It's still important with apples. We can split limbs out of apple trees. Even though it may be perhaps easier to do it with the stone fruits. Keep in mind with apples that we have, fruiting on the spurs that are 2 years old and older. And so we don't want to go in there and think, oh, these little branches that aren't growing much, we need to remove those. No, again, except for the tip bearing apples. Those fruiting spurs are critically important. We remove all our spurs, we don't have apples to eat. So make sure that we aren't removing those without reason. There may be time and place that you would remove some. And certainly with older trees, there is such a thing as renewing the spurs, because they will eventually get less fruitful as they start getting multiple years on them. But again, we don't want to prune all those off. And again, pruning for light and air penetration is kind of the goal of what we're doing. So what about neglected fruit trees? What about trees that maybe have been abandoned, or maybe you just inherited? My wife and I just bought a house. There's an apple tree in the back that hasn't seen much care for a while. Well, first off, you're not going to accomplish everything in 1 year. If you try to do that, you're going to create many problems. So this is going to probably be, 3, maybe even 4 year process to take a very overgrown tree and get it to the more ideal approach. But basically, the process we're going to use for a neglected tree is not going to be any different than we would for one that we prune every year and do a good job. And what I mean by that is it's very basic. So, remove all your dead limbs and branches. I would say that, that doesn't count towards removing a percentage. Typically on like apples, trees, and pears, you don't want to remove much more than 25% of the canopy at any one time. But if dead branches, they're really not an active part of the canopy, so I wouldn't count that. But so if you remove all the dead branches and limbs, and don't over prune. So in a neglected tree, lots of times you can have some rather large branches that shouldn't be there. They're growing up, they're growing across. Don't take out more than 1 or 2 a year. because the more you remove, the more growth you're going to see on what remains. So if you take out a tremendous amount of branches, you're going to see a tremendous amount of growth resulting. And while that sounds good, it's actually not, because the whole key with these trees are you're needing to reduce the canopy. So we don't want to be inducing more and more growth. So there's a balance there. And again, because what we see often with these trees, some of our earlier efforts, so year 1 and year 2, will be removing more out of the top than we do out of lower branches. And the reason we do that, again, the top becomes overgrown, it shades out the bottom tiers of the tree, and we see death and dieback of those bottom tiers. So in year 1, for instance, we may be taking, a majority of what we're pruning out will be up there and a lesser amount on the lower portions. Year 2, typically still the same. Year 3, maybe it's more equal, but we don't want to, again, remove only from the top or only from the bottom. There needs to be a little bit of a balance there, but to begin with, remove more out of the top than out of the bottom. So when we're not talking about, the earlier process I talked about of establishing those primary scaffolds and everything like that was based on establishing young trees. What about a scenario where, we've got a tree that's been there a few years. It's not terribly, horribly overgrown. It's just, it's not a beginning tree. It's established. Well, the first place we start, and this same list I would go through with those overgrown trees. The first 3 are called the 3 Ds: dead limbs, diseased wood. So we look for cankers. So with apples and pears, we're looking things for like fire blight, things of that nature. On peaches, we may be looking for where we have the gummy sap coming out of limbs, where we have damage, things like that. And then damaged limbs, cracked limbs, because maybe we didn't do a good job with thinning fruit, and so we had too great a fruit load on there, or maybe we have a limb that was rubbing into another limb, things like that. These are all very simple. So start with the 3 Ds and remove that out of the canopy. Then move on to water sprouts. Again, water sprouts are those adventitious sprouts, which adventitious sprouts are just popping up from some of those dormant buds. What's bad about those are that they don't have the best, strongest attachment because they're coming from dormant buds. Now, there are scenarios and times where we'll actually use a water sprout where we might need a branch, so they can be useful. But as a general rule, because they're growing straight up, we want to remove those each year. So water sprouts would be our next target whenever we're pruning. We want to prune those out. And again, if we do a lot of pruning this year, we will see more water sprouts next year. So expect that. And that's not a bad thing. It's just the response of the tree, but just understand that's going to happen. Then we want to look at hangers. So hangers are just limbs that are growing down or on the underside of limbs. And what's bad about those is what they end up doing is they kind of push all of the limbs down below it as well, because again, it creates more shade. So if we have branches that are hanging down, or if we have branches that are coming off underneath, that's going to impact those lower tiers of branches. And so we want to remove those. Again, there's an occasion where we may leave one if it's growing in a direction that works for the branches below, but as a rule, we want to remove them. And then crowded branches rubbing or crossing over each other. This is something that as the tree grows, some of those secondary branches that are, or even tertiary branches that are coming onto the tree may suddenly cause a problem when they didn't the year prior. And so this is just something that as the tree grows, you'll balance and play with it and remove some limbs to prevent things from being too close to each other where they physically rub and cause damage, or don't allow good air and sunlight penetration because they're crossing over each other. So again, this is kind of the list that I would tackle any tree pruning job with, kind of go down through this system. If you start this way, what it does is it helps you get to what you're looking for. So to me, if we do these things first, Then we can do a little bit more finesse sort of things where we, make sure that open vase is still open in the center. So if we have anything that is trying to change its direction or cause a problem there, or in the sake of apple and pear trees, if we have something that's trying to compete with that central leader. So if we don't just have a single highest growing point, if we have multiple, that's where we would then follow up and remove that. But again, these basic things, these 6 steps, if we kind of tackle the list this way, um, basically it's a recipe for success, I think. And so this is a way to uncomplicate. So if you go out there and look at a tree and you think, how in the world am I going to get this shape out of this tree? Don't start there. Start with this list in mind. Start removing those things you know are wrong. And as you do that, it will make other things appear better. And so I think that's it. Don't get overwhelmed at the beginning.